Ever been blindsided and then tossed into a spiral of what is my identity? Thanks so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. I'm so glad you are here. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk. Joining me today is my friend, pastor, speaker, and cold plunge enthusiast, Ryan Guerra. He shares about the importance of relying on God's grace and finding hope in the midst of difficult circumstances.
And I think probably the biggest thing that God's exposed in me is like not having a robust enough theology of suffering. I've talked about this on stage and I've preached where Jesus preaches, blessed are you when you're persecuted, rejoice, be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And that's so much easier to preach on a Sunday morning than it is to live out on a Wednesday afternoon. Just the hypocrisy of me realizing like maybe not being aware of like how hard of things people actually go through.
Here's my conversation with Ryan Guerra. About you, but if you have met somebody for the first time, if somebody immediately goes in for a hug, I know I'm going to love this person. And Ryan, that is you. Welcome to the Parable Podcast.
Yeah, it's a really like all-in move. It's kind of like either this person is going to avoid me for the rest of their life or else they're going to be my best friend. So
Ryan and I met this last winter at a retreat, and I work with his wife with Women's Speaker Collective. And yeah, the first time I knew who you were, I knew what a picture of you looked like. And so to meet you for the first time, like you just exude joy and like fun and laughter, and also just like a sense of we're up for anything. Like, let's go. I mean, my favorite thing is we were going on a walk in Utah and there was like all of these trampolines in the ground. And you're like, I'm just going to go up and I'm going to go jump on one. And you did. That's what I appreciate about you is like, I'm just going for it.
Yeah. I mean, fortunately, those people didn't have a fence and they didn't seem to be home. So that was definitely in our favor. But it's interesting meeting someone in a context where like we're at this boundless retreat where you've kind of like heard of the people and you've seen pictures and stuff. And I've just heard like amazing things about this girl named Danielle who's doing work with Women's Speakers Collective. And yeah, it's just cool to meet people that you kind of feel like you already know. And yeah, thanks. We'll have to go raid some more trampolines in Utah together again sometime.
No cops were called, so that's always a win. Ryan, what would you say, like, what are the things that you're passionate about? What do you like to do with your life day to day? I know you love a good cold plunge. Other than that, what else?
I am really into cold plunging. We haven't figured out, like, it's too warm here to keep our tub cold, so we're kind of struggling with that right now. Kind of my two favorite hobbies are, like, kind of polar opposite type things, but I like playing pretty much any sport that's, like, an active running sport, not like golf or something where you just stand around. And I'm not really good at any of them, but I like playing them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I really love like nerdy strategy board games. So really where you're just sitting and thinking, and probably one of the most inactive things you can do physically. So
you were in like a touring band. Tell me about that life. How did that even happen? Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, I did enjoy it. I mean, it's like probably one of the funnest jobs you can think of. When we were in high school, like grade 11, or as you guys would say in the US, my junior year, I met this guy and we decided to start this punk rock band. And most people in high school bands got the memo that after high school, you're supposed to quit the band and go to university and make something out of your life. And we didn't get the notice. And so we kind of kept going a bit. And then all of a sudden, like 2 years after high school, we hit the road full time and did that full time. We were on the road like usually 9 or 10 months out of a year. We did that for almost 10 years. Yeah, it was a blast. I mean, like on the surface, we were a rock and roll band, mostly not touring in like the church and Christian world, but getting to do just like some really cool ministry, like in clubs and venues across the US, mostly a bit of Europe, a little bit of Canada. It was a blast, man. Like it's a really different life. Talisi, my wife, and I got married in the middle of that season. We got married 2 days later. We had a show not too far away. Then we had a week off and then we took off on tour. So like 9 days after our wedding, we took off on tour. And so her and I, for the first half a year of our marriage, shared like a single bunk on a bus full of guys, like 5 or 6 other guys. It had a curtain. So, you know, some privacy and stuff like that. Essentially, our honeymoon was like 6 months touring the US, bit of Europe, that kind of thing. And we just got to have that time together and it was a blast. So got to do that. It was awesome. Does feel like a lifetime ago, though.
Has music always been a part of your life? I remember one of the nights at the retreat, like you and a couple of the other girls were singing like old school songs. So I'm curious, has like music always been there? Have you always played an instrument, or did that come later on?
Yeah, my mom started me in piano, which when I was 2 years old, which now that I have little kids, I'm like, wow, that's like psychopathic, right? Like, I'm just like, I can't imagine. We actually tried that with our daughter and it just failed miserably, but she did that. And at first it was fine. Shortly in, I like hated it. It was like hour practice every morning, Monday to Friday kind of thing. But I did like classical piano until I finished my grade 8 piano and she let me quit. And at that point I was like, I am never playing music again in my life. I hate music. I was like, I can't stand it. And then 9 years later, it's like my full-time job. So I guess kind of the irony there of like swearing something off and then it being one of the biggest chapters of your life. Honestly, in this season of my life, like I don't play that much music. Once I stopped touring, I really started digging into some different things and ways to kind of serve Jesus that kind of just overshadowed it. Then I had kids and kids kind of ruin everything and kind of kill any hobby or interest you have. And so I hope, my daughters are 6 and 3. I've started teaching my 6-year-old piano. I'd be cool if like that could be something I could do with my daughters. So we'll see how that shakes out.
What do you think is the most interesting thing about being a parent right now? And what is a challenge for you?
One thing that's so interesting is like what I'm doing right now is like a lot of freelance speaking and stuff like that. So I've just gone for a week and then home for a week and then gone for a week. And I'm not usually gone that much. But when you're about to go away as a parent, you're just like, oh man, I'm going to get to like sleep in the morning and like just like have it chill. Like on the other hand, my wife is like on duty and stuff like that. But it's interesting because like within a day, it's just like, I wish I was being woken up early by these kids, you know, like you just miss them. And there's also like, you know, your kids, I think can frustrate you and test your patience. But, you know, at the end of like a hard day when people have been not so great to you or like you've gone through some stuff, you come in the door and like there's something like so pure about that hug from your kid. Parents of teenagers that are listening to this are probably like, no, you have no idea, Ryan. It's not like that. But like, you know, while my kids are still young, I'm just enjoying like, you know, I can just come and like hug my 3-year-old and be like, oh, you know what, like this is normal and this is good. And I find that really interesting. Challenging is like me trying to not be a horrible human being. Like I'm just like, you know, before you get married, people are like, marriage is tough. And then you have kids and you're like, oh man, like I thought I had a hard time like being patient and kind, kind of fulfilling my wedding vows to like my partner. And now it's like, you know, there's that expression. It's like, you know, don't cry over spilled milk. And it's more like dads don't like lose your crap over spilled milk. You know, it's like, as it's like, what's my problem? Like, why am I getting so frustrated by stuff when I could just be chill with my kids? So that's something I find hard.
I would agree. The same thing. I think we were talking about a previous episode you listened to, Ashley Island, and she had something on there about setting an expectation and recognizing your child has only been on this earth for X amount of years. So we have an 11 and a 14-year-old. And so just to remind ourselves like that they're like growing. Also, I've never done this before. I don't know. I'm trying to be a good human as well. So I get that. That's true. When you think back growing up, I know your heart is for people to experience Jesus. When did you really experience Jesus? Or was that like a hard road leading up to where you are today?
Yeah. So I was born a pastor's kid. In fact, I popped out at like 5:30 a.m. on a Sunday and my dad was there for it. And then he went and beacon at 9 a.m. and pretty like hardcore. But I often say there are two stereotypes. And one is that they're like a perfect angel and the other is that they're like a hell child. And my parents had one of each stereotype and my sister's name is actually literally Angel. So I think they kind of like spoke that one into existence. And then I came along. A lot of times people talk about a rebellious phase. I think it was less that. Like, I don't think I was like rebelling or like trying to be like, screw you to my parents. I more just was like, I just thought church was so boring. I grew up in this hyper charismatic church in the 80s and 90s where like service would just go on for 9 hours and we didn't have iPads and, you know, like it just didn't exist. Like at best we could maybe go down and there might be a TV and a VCR and there might be like a Salty or Charity Church Mouse or Gospel Bill, if you remember that stuff. Like, and that was like at best, right? You know, like maybe there'd be some leftover communion bread and juice and we could like hit that hard, but it was just a boring experience. So I really hated it. My parents made me go to Christian school. I just thought it was like boring. I didn't care. I don't think I didn't believe in God. I was just kind of like, it sucks. And so I just was pretty disengaged. By junior high, started rolling with like a pretty tough crowd. And so like by high school, I got like kicked out of school, arrested a couple times, thinking back now that, you know, I've been a pastor and kind of doing pastoral work now, like it would be so tricky navigating that path with your kids while you're like pastoring a community. But it was actually in that, like, this is not my parable. This is Jesus's parable. But he has a story of like the wise and the foolish builder. There's the wise man who builds on the rock and the foolish builder who builds on the sand foundation. I think there's this like, I wouldn't have termed it this way because I didn't know much about the Bible at this point in grade 11. But I just think this like coming to terms with the fact that like I had built on the sandy foundation and the storms had come and they had like dismantled everything. And my life was a disaster and pretty messed up. My parents made me homeschool in grade 11 because they like didn't feel like safe to send me to like a school and have me out of their supervision. And so, yeah, in that season, I just kind of like felt desperate. And like I said, I never didn't believe God was real. So I decided to give him a shot, give him a chance. And man, like totally transformed my life. There were some faithful youth pastors and friends and my parents and stuff like that who kind of didn't stop praying for me, didn't stop caring for me. And I experienced Jesus in a pretty crazy way. By crazy, I don't mean like something like just changed my life, saved my heart. Since then, I've just been like, what can I do to share that hope and that excitement about who Jesus is with other people?
Gosh, we think like the people who've been faithful in our life walking alongside us. I mean, that's really what love is. And like how people exude Jesus of just being faithful. Like when we look at the disciples and the people Jesus met on and off in his life, sometimes they were the outsiders. Sometimes they were the less lovable. And he just kept walking with them. And so that's what I appreciate. The youth pastors that are out there just like loving these kids with so much emotion, so many things going on in their life. So
I'm helping out with this student ministry in the Vancouver area here that's kind of between youth pastors. At this, or I speak at a lot of camps or whatever, often have like cabin leaders or youth leaders say like, oh man, this student is just being so disruptive during small group time and just like struggling with their behavior and getting so frustrated. And what I usually say is I'm like, just a reminder that Jesus was a small group leader. And one of his small group boys was Judas, who literally like helped him get crucified for a small amount of money. And it's like, you come to me. I get that it's hard sometimes to be a youth leader, but it's like, you come to me when one of your students is doing that and we'll deal with it really like decisively. Until then, let's just try our best to like walk that path Jesus did. Like he knew this was coming. And man, he just like kept giving Judas chances and, you know, opened up the door of reconciliation to him. And I think that's, you're right. That's so beautiful. Like how often do I struggle to treat people like that? And Jesus is just so brilliant at it. So
Jesus is brilliant and he has like the way he spoke. And I just like can't wait to get to heaven and like hear him speak and just share and love on people. It's going to be a good time. But in the meantime, we do have these stories that we get to share and we get to see God's work, how it continues to play out into our own life. So Ryan, I'd love for you to share one of your parable stories with us today.
You know, I've been on this planet for a little while now. So when you invited me, which I'm so honored to be on your podcast, it's been fun listening along and really it's just, it's exciting to be here. So thanks for having me. But it's kind of processing through like which stories to share. And you know, when you go through something kind of big or tough, the question is always like, when is like the moment to start talking about this?
Yeah.
And obviously you talk about it with like friends and stuff, but kind of like more openly or publicly. And so I was planning on sharing something that's like a little bit more recent. By recent, I mean like over a year and a half ago that I haven't shared about that much. So I'll just kind of like hop into it and feel free to interrupt me and poke it is along the way. But after high school, I spent 10 years touring in a rock and roll band. After that, hung up my guitar to kind of shift my focus into local church work. I worked at a church for out there in a camp for about 7 years. While I was there, it was like this brilliant experience. Talisi worked there. She actually worked there for longer than I did. We got to work together. It was like such a rad season of ministry together. But if you've been around churches or you've worked in a church or whatever, you know, you've probably seen and experienced like, you know, these places often go through challenges. It's actually funny when I was a pastor's kid as like a young adult, I remember seeing some of these like political challenges or shifts that churches went through and just being like, oh, this is tough. And I remember thinking as a young adult, you know, my generation, millennials, we're not going to put up with this political stuff. It's going to be different when we're older and in charge. And I actually think it's worse. And in my experience where it's just like, there's just so much of this going on. So anyways, at the church I was at, we had this really cool run, but then kind of there's some like tough shifts inside. And so you start to ask that question, like, hey, God, like, I'd love to be here forever as associate pastor there, but getting to do like, you know, 50% of the teaching, which I love getting to teach about scripture and stuff like that. But yeah, just some shifts where you're like, God, like, I want to be here, but I don't know, like, is there a sense that like a shift is coming up? Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of going back and forth, praying, thinking, trying to process through that. And then all of a sudden, my best friend, who's the youth pastor, he got one of those like sudden terminations. He'd been there for over 12 years, killing it and all that. And all of a sudden he was just like gone. And I watched his like leadership, like really work to like control a narrative. And they kept changing the story and saying things that weren't very honest. And it was really hard for me, but that was the moment where I was like, well, you know what? I think this is probably like as clear of a sign as I could get that it's probably time for like what's next in our season of life. So I started looking around and I found this lead pastor gig out in the Vancouver area. And I was like, yeah, sounds really dope. So we'll go and do that. And so I did that, took off in September 2020. You're in Chicago. So I think you guys are probably a little closer to like our COVID kind of vibe. Some of your Southern US friends listening to this, like remember COVID as like a few weeks off of church gathering. When I went to this church, they had 6 months of not in-person gatherings. And then the next year, like the first year of my time there was digital, which honestly, we had a blast. So I came out to this gig and it was interesting because I'd watched my friend get treated pretty poorly by a church community, by leaders in that church community. But I'd also like, you know, known a lot of people that those types of things had happened. And as I journeyed in kind of church ministry more, heard more and more of these stories of just like broken, dysfunctional relationships and challenges and stuff like that. And, you know, becoming more and more aware of that. But you could know like 1,000 people around you that like get a terminal disease. And you'll operate like that's never going to happen to me, right? You know, it's like, you know, everyone's like could get sick or whatever. And you're just like, no, but not me, right? Like I'm safe, I'm getting stuff. So I just thought, you know, I didn't really think through that a lot. Like, you know, when is it going to be my turn? Or like, what if this happens to me? Kind of foreshadowing a bit. But yeah, we had this like really cool year of like digital church stuff going on. We had like saw God doing so many cool things. I don't really care about numbers. I think it's a bad way to measure church health and success. However, in that season, like during COVID, we like saw like tons of new people coming in, like even those metrics that some people are obsessed with were like doing really well. So it was really cool. So when we got back in person, we actually like, it was really exciting, but it was also, there's this like tension of like some of the things we had stumbled across digitally that were like, are we going to like lose that or whatever? But it was, we hopped back in person September of 2021, like a year into my time there. Things were going really well, getting to experiment with some cool things, lots of like neat stuff happening that God was doing in our community. This was a church with like a board, and in the kind of early in 2022, well, February, March of 2022, there was like, you know, where board members like have hit their maximum lifespan as a board member. So we had some turnover. I don't know the people there that well because I haven't been there that long, but also being digital and stuff. But we got a couple new people on the board, and all of a sudden, like within a couple months, I'm sitting there on a Wednesday afternoon. I've got all my teaching stuff in for the Sunday. I actually like, this is just kind of ironic. I spent the last like the 2 hours before this moment, making annotations on our church bylaws, which is like probably the most incredibly boring and awful and tedious work a lead pastor could do, that they would only do if they're like, I'm going to be here for another 5 or 10 years. I had monthly prayer days that I would get each of us as a staff to take and all that. So the next day is going to be my prayer day, and then I was going to have the weekend and then teach on Sunday. I'm sitting there, and also I'm like blindsided by this meeting with these 3 board members, and they come in with like a stack of legal documents. And again, I don't know, it's like in Illinois, but in British Columbia, the province I live in, you can terminate without cause. So they came in and they read this letter, and it starts out good. And you can just tell when someone's like reading you a letter that starts out good, you're like, okay, well, there's like a wrecking ball coming behind this. You know, it starts with like all the nice positive things. And then all of a sudden it's like, it goes into this like vague, I don't know what to call it, this kind of vague diatribe about like, well, maybe this happened or whatever. And then all of a sudden it was like, you're not fit to be our pastor anymore. And it was like, I was sitting there just like, what? Like we just had like the past 5 weeks before that were just like some of the like coolest gatherings. We tried some new things that were like, this is like going so well. And yeah, all of a sudden it was just like, you're done, Ryan. And got handed like legal documents, like a non-disclosure agreement, which I'm like vocally against being used in churches. And this like short letter written to the church that was like, we're writing to let you know of Ryan's decision to end his employment here. And I'm just like, guys, like it was so like mind boggling. And you're just kind of like, yo, what the heck? So anyways, I got fired obviously from that job, and kind of brought me to this point of like, a lot of it like started spiraling into like processing a lot of things about like church and my own identity and stuff like that.
I do find it interesting when you were talking about the foreshadowing of, you know, your friend had walked through this prior And now you witness that. Now you head out to this new job. And I was working on a message the other week. And one of my points was that preparation in our life allows us to see God's providence. And I just think, as painful, nobody wants to be prepared. Nobody wants to be walking through a situation like you did, Ryan. But I would be curious, did you feel like you can now look back and see that God was preparing you for this moment, as painful as it was?
Yeah, it's always like easy to like be like, oh yeah, to a question like that. But honestly, I've said like essentially that same kind of thing to many people, where I've said like one of the greatest graces I think God gave us, this sounds like a horrible present, but was getting to watch my best friend, but also like several other people, like getting to watch so many pastors go through something like that. It really did prepare us, because all of a sudden when, it's a Wednesday afternoon and all of a sudden you're told like you're done and you're never going to see it. Like my last words to the church were the Sunday before were, see you next Sunday. Like literally, like, you can't make that up. And I think without any context or any like seeing others go through this or any of that kind of preparation work, probably we would have like turned to bitterness or rage or like a lot of unhealthy patterns. I'm not saying we've done it all perfectly or anything, but man, I think God was so generous and gracious to us to like let us see how this has played out in other people's lives and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I couldn't agree with your question more, like for sure. But it's interesting because it can be like, oh, I got to see a friend or a bunch of other pastors, and that's like more specific. But like that's the whole Bible. Everyone gets a crappy deal. It's like, it's not like I got thrown in a pit full of lions or in a giant fiery furnace or nailed to a cross or whatever. There are moments where it probably felt like that might have been easier than some of the stuff we went through after this. I think God's always in the business of like trying to prepare us and equip us in advance. But I'm glad I was able to catch on that from the stories from some of my friends. But looking back now, I'm like, why was I so like blind to like all the ways that I think God tries to prepare us for the trials?
You mentioned that you were, after that moment, as anyone would be, kind of just like spiraling. You felt that blindsided, and you were questioning identity, church, as a husband, as a father, as a ministry worker, a pastor. Now, like one of those titles is stripped away and kind of just questioning. Can you walk us through like what you were struggling with after that whole season?
I mean, you go through like all these different like phases. Like on one day, if you live in one of those places where it's like the weather's erratic and it's all over the place, like, it's raining, then all of a sudden it's hot, then all of a sudden it's cold or whatever. I grew up in the prairies of Canada. And so it would often be like that. Like it might be snowing at one part of the day and like bright and sunny at another part of the day and warm. And I think that's kind of like the experience in situations like that, where you're just like, you move your family semi across the country and you're like, we're going to do this thing for like, 10 or 20 years, probably. I actually have a tattoo of like the church logo on my arm. And it's like, you just kind of like, like you bake your identity into that. I think one of the things I've realized is like, for instance, a lot of pastors, and I've watched a bunch of pastors go through this type of thing. And, for the record, there are a lot of pastors and church leaders that like should be fired. Like, there's a lot of challenge going on in the church in a lot of ways. But I've had a lot of friends who just get this like raw deal. And it's not even so much that the job ends, it's just how it happens. But one of the things I think I've noticed is like, and there's probably a better analogy out there, but this is the best I've come up with. Like twine, like that type of string. If you like tie that really tight together, it's hard to like separate. If you tie it really hard together and then leave it for 10 years, it's like impossible to separate. Like it kind of like molds into each other and becomes one. It's kind of like if your kids play with 3 colors of Play-Doh and you get these nice 3 colors and you're like, oh, these are nice 3 colors. And then pretty quickly it's like, no, that's one weird, gross looking grayish black color. So I think for a lot of people, this idea of like pastoring, and I think this was true for myself as well. You have a calling to be a pastor, to like carry the mission of Jesus forward. And then you have this job, and then they like overlap and they become, you're doing that in that context. And it's kind of how you're providing for your family. It kind of becomes one, and you like tie the twine together, kind of mix the Play-Doh together. When all of a sudden one of those gets like fiercely ejected from your life, it's really hard for like the calling to not like get destroyed with it. Right. And I've known pastors where it's like it becomes impossible for them to like untie that twine or to reseparate the Play-Doh afterward. And I think that's work that only God can do. But it's kind of like in COVID when people are like, well, what is church? I guess it's not a building. It's like people. And we've always known that. People really had to start processing that. I think one of the big challenging questions God had for me was like, well, what's a pastor? Like, is it someone that like has the affirmation of a board or like is getting a paycheck from a charitable institution that's like has a fancy title and serves coffee on Sunday mornings? Like, or Ryan, like, have I just called you to be a pastor regardless? And it's interesting because then you think back to the Bible, you think to John the Baptist. It's like, well, he wasn't getting paid. He's eating like bugs and like, sap and that kind of stuff. Like, it wasn't very comfortable, yet he was, I'd say, like the pastor of all pastors. He just went and proclaimed the good news of Jesus. And when they met with me, they gave me these documents and I had to go back and forth to like get them to remove, like, I didn't argue with them about severance. I didn't care about any of the money or anything like that, but I cared about like the integrity of the whole thing. And it was like, it was just awful and dark. And it's really sad, I think, in churches, how like this desire for controlling the narrative and like, what we often cloak as like protecting the name of Jesus, but it's really protecting an institution or organization, can get into these like dark corners that like just are really making truth a low priority. And so I had to go back and forth for like 9 days, just being like, hey, please remove the non-disclosure agreement. Like, we're just, you can say whatever you guys want to the church and I'm just going to like move on and live my life, and like simple, So to go back and forth, but there's this Friday where I had to, send the documents in, July 15th, 2 years ago. And I think I felt like God was just like, Ryan, like at 11:59 a.m. before you sent the document in, you were a pastor, but then at noon you weren't a pastor. Like, is that really how cheap the calling I've put on your life is? Or like, could it just be stripped away like that? Or is it like something deeper and more robust? And yeah, it was just like this real process of like processing identity and recognizing like how much I'm susceptible to this trap of finding my identity in like human built institutions or like the affirmation of others. I'm an Enneagram 3. I love it when people like me and when people affirm me and stuff like that. Like, I crave it. And God's just like, you don't need that. Like, I referenced Danielle earlier, like the lion's den thing. It's actually my middle name and it means the Lord is my judge. And the idea there is like, who cares what people think? Because God's the one who marks my identity. So yeah, a real process of like asking like, well, what is a calling on your life? And can people really strip it away by like giving you a raw deal in an institution? And I'd hope not, but I recognize even for me, like that was a real struggle. So
how has it been kind of walking through when you kind of just when you said you wanted the church to kind of just really speak the truth when that just wasn't going to happen, where you want somebody to say like, I'm sorry, like this was a crap deal. And it's the possibility of never having that. Like, how have you dealt with that?
A year ago, I was down in LA with a group of pastors from Canada, and we were chatting with this guy, and he had like, this guy's like a legendary guy. Like, you sometimes you think about your own story, like, no, maybe I really just do suck, but then like you meet someone who's like, oh, like if you got a raw deal from a church, maybe I'm not as insane, but he has a terrible deal. And anyways, to make the long story short, he told the story about like how like a decade later, one of the board members reached out to him and was like, we messed up. This didn't go right. And they actually invited him and his wife in, and they like washed their feet and like prayed for them and stuff like that. And actually a while later, he became like the interim pastor at that church to help them find their next lead pastor. And anyways, you hear a story like this and I'm like, I'm sitting there as he's just telling this story, not knowing who he's talking to and trying not to like weep and bawl and like real mixed emotions where I'm just like, that's so beautiful. Like, God, thank you that you did that. But also this like, man, that's just like probably never going to happen in my life. It's interesting looking back at this now. There were no lead ups, no warning signs, like nothing. It was just sudden. It was out of nowhere. And not all the board was there. It was just this weird situation. But a few weeks before that, I met a previous associate pastor of this church. And he told me a story about a couple decades earlier where there's this lead pastor who had been there for like a decade. He was amazing. People loved him. And all of a sudden the board did this same thing. He didn't say the same thing because this was before and I had no idea it was coming. And I actually was like, I walked away from that meeting thinking, I'm going to track down that pastor and we're going to like do some repentance work as a community. And then a few weeks later, I got fired. So I was like, well, I guess we're not going to do that. But this is what I'll say. I can talk in conflict. People like, we always talk about the other party and it's always so like, there's a huge magnifying glass up to their issues and stuff like that. For me, I think it's been like God saying like, Ryan, do you actually like what you preach about on stage? Do you actually believe that? And do you actually live that? So like, I've taught through the Sermon on the Mount in many contexts and Jesus says, pray for your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, pray for those who like aren't kind, right? Like love them, pray for them, bless them. In Romans 12, Paul says the same thing. He says like, bless those who are unkind to you. Like, be good to them. Don't return evil with evil, but return good for evil. It's that moment where God's like, Ryan, do you actually like, you've told people to pray for those who aren't good to them. Like, do you believe that? Like, can you do that? And actually like reframing a lot of my prayer life, my prayer time and spiritual disciplines about trying to like return kindness, even though like there will likely never be any conversation, any closure, no apology or anything like that. And Jesus is saying like, well, do you trust me enough to like, just pray for them and trust the words that I'm saying are really good. And, I just have to believe in Matthew 6, Jesus talks about giving in secret, praying in secret, fasting in secret, and saying like your heavenly Father will reward you for what's done in secret. And the real challenge there, I think, is trust. Like, it's just like, do I actually trust that? Or like, do I need to look for something in this temporary earth? And I think that's the challenge for me is I think God's really put a magnifying glass on like the areas of my life I don't trust him with and how little I do actually trust him, and saying like, do you trust me that you could just pray for your enemies? And that's maybe all you do for like the next 40 years of your life and nothing else happens. Do you trust me that that's enough? And I'm saying that right now as though I'm like, I've mastered it. And I haven't. It's so hard. In fact, it's actually, you mentioned cold plunging. I love cold plunging. People for years, I've noticed like vegans and CrossFitters have this thing that they get to like try to evangelize the world to. And it's like, I wish I had one. So I took on cold plunging because we have to be as like rabidly evangelistic about that. But one of the things I love is like my prayer sanctuary. And I've just devoted over times, like a lot of my time to like praying for that church community and those people who said some really unkind and untrue things about me to many people, and just releasing that to God and just praying for them. And I think when Jesus tells us to pray for those who hurt us, he's not just saying this is the thing you're supposed to do, but he's actually like prescribing like some of the best medicine in that situation, where he's like, if you could pray for those people, it's really going to heal your heart a lot, Ryan. And it's hard to trust, but in my experience, it's actually been kind of true. So
Ryan, thanks for just being so honest about this process and just saying like, this is a hard season, and really taking that internal look. Like you're right. It's so easy to be like, let me blame all of you of how you've affected me, and turning it around to a positive in a sense of like, how can I continue to grow and like tend to my own soul and be aware of the areas of my life where just need some watering. It's hard. It's so painful. Yeah. Anything else from after that season that you wanted to share?
I think I'll share like kind of my biggest takeaway, and I'll try to be a little bit more brief. I know like I love to talk, and I just don't want this podcast episode to be 9 hours long. So getting fired was like tough, and going through kind of like the gross political process that they started was tough. The harder thing was, as a pastor, when you leave a church, pastors often think about like legacy. Legacy doesn't really exist. Like no one's going to sit around and watch my sermons for years to come or whatever. And I wouldn't even want them to. There's like better content out there. But what you do have, hopefully when you walk away from a community like that, is relationships. And like, that's kind of the most valuable thing you can maintain from there. And unfortunately, I think maybe it was connected to me being unwilling to like engage in like the practice of like NDAs in church and stuff like that. They kind of took a really big stand and spread a lot of really untrue things about me and my family. And it was just a really brutal thing. And like, I'd be in like a different country and like talking to a pastor there, and they're like, I've heard from like your church in Canada, like, and it's like really intense. And I can shake my head at that. Yeah. But what I can really do is step back and be like, what is it that's missing in my life? And I think probably the biggest thing that God's exposed in me is like not having a robust enough theology of suffering. I've talked about this on stage, and I've preached where Jesus preaches, blessed are you when you're persecuted, rejoice, be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Man, that's so much easier to preach on a Sunday morning than it is to live out on a Wednesday afternoon.
Absolutely.
Just the hypocrisy of me realizing like maybe not being aware of like how hard of things people actually go through. And when all of a sudden you've got like a smear campaign from a board, like reaching pastors and churches and all these people and just destroying relationships and stuff like that as you walk away, I'm just reminded, like Jesus said, rejoice. This is the way they treated the prophets who were before you. And in Luke 6, he actually says, woe to you if everyone likes you, because that's how they treated the false prophets. And then you read scripture and it's like throughout all of it, there's like this joy and this like growth that comes through suffering. My wife Talisi actually put out a book in 2020, and it's like so hilarious because it's called Joy Like a Mountain. So much of it is about like joy in the suffering. And I don't think we realize like, when you write that book, you're like, these are true ideas. And then all of a sudden a couple of years later, like, oh, like that book was written for me. Like, like my understanding of how God can shape and grow me through suffering has not been deep enough, and I have not trusted God enough with that. I was like surprised when this happened. And that's like the thing where I'm like, why was I so surprised? I love reading about like all these stories of trial and challenge throughout scripture. And I can read about the crucified Jesus. And I love that he like gave everything. He was brutally treated. He was awfully treated. And I love that. I love that he did that for me. And then I think I can follow him and walk a path where it's like really cushy, cozy. And I've got my salary and benefits in place, and that could never be challenged. And I just realized, and like, I think it was God saying like, Ryan, you need to figure out a deeper way to understand joy and growth in the midst of suffering and trials and when people are tough to you. And this is the last thing I'll say. I think one of the things that happens when you go through a tough moment, or it can happen, a lot of times maybe negative things happen, but one of the neat things that can happen is all of a sudden parts of the Bible that you've like read through kind of quickly or like not spent a lot of time on, all of a sudden like the light bulb goes off and you're like, I get it. And one of those for me, there are many, but one of those for me in this season is like that moment when Peter denies Jesus when Jesus is about to get crucified. I've always read that as like big deal. Jesus is like stripped naked, beaten half to death, getting lied about, humiliated. He's about to get nailed to a cross. Who cares if a dude is like, I don't know, you know? But then I've like really realized in this season, in the season where like I've experienced a lot of betrayal from people that I really trusted, where I'm like, oh, like Jesus is going through this horrible thing and he's looking over and he's like, but at least I got Peter, right? At least my boy Peter's got my back. And he looks over and Peter's like, no, sorry, bro. Like I'm actually not going down this road with you. You're on your own. And I'm just like, I think it's helped me humanize Jesus more and just realize like that human journey Jesus went on is actually the call of Jesus and embrace him. Now, it sounds good the way I'm saying it. I don't have this all figured out. I'm still like, this stuff still stings and it still hurts and all that, and it's unjust. But man, God's been teaching us so much and he is so kind to us. And I think I've just been challenged to be like, why would I expect to have a cushy ride going down that narrow path behind the crucified, suffering servant that Jesus is? And there's so much joy and so much growth to be gained in the midst of suffering. So I said I'd be brief. That probably wasn't that brief, but that's probably my biggest.
It's really good, Ryan. I think that's just like the human experience and how you connected that to Peter. You're right. Like when you read through like parts of the Bible, it just hits differently. And that's why like the Bible, it is truly living and active because it's walking with us through our life's journey. As we wrap up, I'd love for you to kind of just speak to the person who's listening right now and they feel whatever their situation, they feel blindsided. They're kind of questioning their identity. Does church matter? Is God even in this? And I would love to know what would be your encouragement to them.
We all get hurt by people and we know that's going to happen. But when it does, a lot of times I think the surprise is like who and when and how and all of that. And we just can't really predict that or prepare ourselves for that on a practical level. The first thing I'd say to someone who's like maybe just gotten like hurt, and maybe I'll speak specifically like maybe by like an institution or an organization that claims like Jesus in its name or whatever, just like know that like you're not alone. And I don't say that like, oh, hey, I went through something, but like throughout the entire story of the Bible, like, I mean, by the second book you get to, like the entire nation of Israel is like being oppressed and brutalized by this evil Pharaoh, you know, and you continue on and you just see story of trial after trial after trial. You arrive at this story about this guy named David who is nothing but faithful, and he is just like kind and generous and like helps people and all of that and does all of the like Jesus-y things. Even before he knew who Jesus was, he does all of these Jesus-y things and he gets cast out. And when Saul is like after him and attacking him, he's hardly got anyone who's like got his back. Like he feels alone. He feels isolated. And Jesus felt this way right before his crucifixion as well. So my first encouragement is just know that you're not alone, but also know that the company on the path that you're walking along, the persecuted path, the hurt path, is like a path full of like the greatest heroes throughout the history of scripture and also the church. Like we have the Bible in print because a guy named Tyndale was willing to get burned at the stake in order to be a part of like giving that to us. You know, it's like these stories of people just getting a really raw deal from people. And then it culminates in Jesus. I think back to the start of Genesis 1 where God says he created people in his image. And it's often like used as like an affirming, like, you go girl, you're made in God's image. That's what people usually say to me, you go girl, right? No, but I think there's something more than God just observing like, hey, our creation looks like us. I think he's saying, hey, our creation is made to go and be a light and to reflect us to the world around us. Even beat up, even damaged, even chipped away at diamonds can refract and reflect light and can shine brilliantly and brightly. And I think a lot of times those chips in our lives, those wounds in our lives are often maybe the moments where God might be able to shine his light through and use us as an example more and more. So if you're out there, you've been beat up, please don't give up hope. I think your struggle and your challenge can be used to like totally dismantle the calling that God's put on your life, but it can also be used to like really galvanize it and turn it into this like true reflective thing of his character and his nature in the midst of that. Don't give up. Find someone who can encourage you and support you. Trust that God, your Father, is journeying through that with you, has journeyed through that, and that he cares about you, and that your calling isn't tied to what people think of you or what job you might have or some of that treatment. Your calling is simply tied to that like early garden narrative where God said, you're made in my image, now go bear and shine my light to people around you.
I think that was a perfect answer, Ryan. You don't have to question that. I think that what you showcased and shared in this episode is just like your heart, the hard times, the honesty, but how you wove it back into scripture and just connected it in a way so that we can better understand how Jesus, he walks alongside with us. So thank you so much for sharing today.
You're so kind, Danielle. It's such an honor to get to be here with you today.
All of Ryan's information, how to connect with him, his website, and social media will be in today's show notes. Ryan, thanks so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, friend.
Gosh, I love the richness of how Ryan tied in his own journey and captured the heart of so many truths from the Bible. All of Ryan's contact information is available in today's show notes, or you can visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Ryan. Number 1, can you remember a time where you felt blindsided? What have you learned about yourself, your faith, or your identity since then? Number 2, in what ways can you create a more robust theology of suffering for your own life so that when a season comes, which we know it will, you can pull from it? Thanks so much to my lovely producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so great. I am thankful that you took the time to spend it with me today. Remember, your parable showcases how he will journey with you throughout being blindsided. We'll see you again next week on the Parable Podcast.